Not leave her alone, Elmer shouted as one of Kessler's riders reached down for Dora Sloane. He dropped the boundary stone he had been paid to move and stepped into the dust, spreading his empty hands against 10 drawn colts. At his boots, Dora knelt in the running spring. One side of her skirt was soaked, her loosened hair clung to her cheek, and the cracked limestone marker was locked against her chest. She ignored the guns. She stared at the empty groove Elmer had torn into the Dakota earth. You just moved the only thing keeping 3 camps from fighting over water. She said, her voice trembling with something harder than fear. Elmer kept his hands raised. He did not reach for the colt at his hip. Kessler had hired him to clear a spring for a thirsty herd. No one had said the useless rubble would be held in a woman's arms. "Step aside, Parrish," Oswald Kessler called from his roan. The cattle boss snapped shut his pocket watch. "The herd reaches this valley on the 5th day. I want the east trench open before then. Let the woman go back to her waystation." Elmer didn't move. He looked down at Dora. Her dress was soaked at the hem. Her knuckles were white on the limestone. She wasn't begging. She was guarding. "Where do you want me?" Elmer asked her. His voice was low-pitched, just for the 2 of them over the sound of the water. Dora blinked. The hostility in her eyes fractured just for a second, replaced by pure surprise. "Between them and the shovels," she breathed. "Not between them and me." Elmer shifted his weight, putting his boots directly over the groove where the stone had been. "You heard her," he told Kessler. "No digging." A muscle twitched in Kessler's jaw. "You're fired, Parrish. The roan you rode in on belongs to my outfit." He leveled a finger at Dora. "You have until noon on the 5th day, Miss Sloane. Open that flow, or we run the herd over the bank and open it ourselves." Kessler wheeled his horse. The 10 men lowered their colts, spitting into the dust before turning their mounts to follow. The hoofbeats faded toward the Missouri River. Their silence held only waters spilling into the wooden trough. Elmer finally lowered his arms. He looked at the heavy stone in Dora's hands, then at the groove he had blindly torn it from. He reached down to help her up. Dora flinched back and tightened both arms around the stone. "Don't touch it. Don't touch anything. If you mean to walk behind me, you listen before you move. Do you understand?" Elmer dropped his hand. He gave a slow nod. "I understand." The walk back to the way station took an hour. Elmer carried his heavy saddle on his shoulder, the leather creaking with every step. Dora walked ahead of him, her skirt kicking up small clouds of dust. She carried the limestone rock like it was an infant. Her station sat in a shallow fold beside the wagon road, a stout timber building, a broad corral, and a dry garden of feverfew sage and yarrow. Teamsters, settlers, and Lakota riders all watered there. Its usefulness also made it dangerous. When they reached the porch, Dora finally set the stone down by the door. She didn't thank him. She pointed to the livery barn. "You can sleep in the hay. Not because you stepped in front of those guns, but because you're the only man who knows exactly which ridge Kessler is bringing those steers over. I appreciate the hospitality," Elmer said. He spent the evening watching her work. She didn't stop. She checked the troughs, portioned out buckets to the station horses, and tended her garden. When she finally took a drink from the dipper, she did it only after every animal was settled. She moved with the particular rhythm of someone who had long ago decided she was the only one she could rely on. Just before dusk, a rider approached. A Lakota woman on a painted mare swung down and walked straight to the limestone rock by the door. "Monsi?" Dora said, stepping off the porch. Monsi traced the fresh dirt on the stone. Then she looked at the water trickling into the main trough. It was cloudy. "The upper flow is muddy," Mansi said. She turned her gaze to Elmer standing in the shadows of the barn. "Is this the man?" "Yes," Dora said. Mansi walked over to him. She did not look angry. That would have been easier. "Repeat the order you were given, exactly as the cattle boss said it." Elmer set his jaw. He didn't like being interrogated in a barn he didn't own. But he remembered the way Dora had clutched that rock. "He told me to go up to the spring head. Said there were 3 useless rocks blocking the old natural trench. Told me to pry them out so the water would run straight down the east ridge to the grazing land." Mansi looked back at Dora. He didn't know. "Ignorance doesn't put the water back," Dora said quietly. "No," Mansi agreed. "But it may mean he is no longer Kessler's dog." She looked Elmer over. "We go up at first light. You may come if you can keep your hands to yourself." Elmer rubbed the back of his neck. "I've been told I'm a hazard by 2 different women before supper. I reckon I'll keep my hands in my pockets." He slept on his saddle blanket while wind worried the barn roof. He had come north to earn another patch of land after his last one burned. Now he was horseless and sleeping in the hay of a woman who watched him like a revolver with a loose hammer. Dawn broke cold and gray. The water in the trough hadn't cleared. It was the color of old clay. Dora was already at the trough when Elmer stepped out. She held up a freshly cut willow branch. The leaves were still green, the wood pale where the knife had bitten into it. "It washed down in the night," she said. "Someone is damming the seep above the rocks." Elmer frowned, reading the angle of the cut. "That's a clean slice. Hatchet, not a knife." He looked up at the jagged Dakota ridge. "I brought steers through the upper pass last spring. I can lead you up the goat paths. We can see the seep without being seen." Dora hesitated. She looked at Mansi, who gave a slight nod. "Fine," Dora said. "But you walk last, and you don't move a single branch, rock, or piece of dirt unless I ask you to." "Understood," Elmer said. The climb was steep. Elmer stayed behind and watched Dora choose each foothold. She knew every fold in the limestone and every shelf where a horse could breathe. The ridge was not empty country to her. It was a language. When they crested the ridge, they looked down into the narrow gorge, where the spring bubbled up from the deep earth. 3 willow stakes had been driven into the mud, forcing the seep away from the station channel and toward the cattle trail. Each stake bore a deep V-shaped notch near the top. Before Elmer could speak, the sound of boots on gravel echoed up the gorge. 4 of Kessler's men were walking up the lower trail carrying shovels. Elmer felt his pulse spike. The old instinct flared: draw iron step in front, handle the threat. His hand brushed the grip of his peacemaker. He looked at Dora. She was staring at the stakes, her face pale. If a gunfight started here, the law would come. The station would be crawled over by marshals. Her quiet control would be gone. Elmer pulled his hand away from his gun. He tapped Dora's shoulder and pointed to a narrow fissure in the rock wall behind them. An old cattle cut. He didn't speak. He just waited. Dora read the choice in his eyes. She nodded. They backed away silently, slipping into the fissure, while Kessler's men argued over where to dig next. Elmer led them down the winding back trail, keeping himself between them and the drop-off, but never once taking the lead. It was the first fight Elmer had ever left, while every proud bone in him insisted he could win it. When they got back to the station, the sun was high, and the heat was punishing. The stagecoach from Bismarck was due in 2 hours. Elmer took a shovel from the barn and started clearing the silt out of the lower trenches to keep what little water they had flowing. Dora worked beside him, using a tin dipper to clear the delicate wooden joints of the trough. A large flat stone had slid down the bank, partially blocking a side channel. Elmer leaned his shovel against the fence and bent down to heave it out of the way. Before his fingers could find a grip, the tin dipper cracked hard against his knuckles. Elmer snatched his hand back. Dora was kneeling beside him, her chest rising and falling quickly. "What did I say?" she demanded. "It's blocking the flow," Elmer said, keeping his voice level. "It's supposed to block the flow," she snapped. She pointed the dipper at the water. "If you move that rock, the water rushes the trough too fast, overflows into the dirt, and leaves the upper basin dry by evening. It's a baffle. It slows the pulse." Elmer looked at the water. She was right. The stone wasn't debris, it was engineering. Mancy sat on a wooden crate. "The 3 stones you tried to pry up yesterday do the same work for the valley. One branch feeds the station, one crosses the grazing ground, one reaches the winter camp used by my kin. The sharing began before this town had a name. It was never a gift from the settlers." Elmer felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Kessler told me they were just rubble." "Kessler wants it all," Dora said, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist. "If he tears out the stones, the water rushes down to his side. We dry up. Mancy's people dry up. We fight each other, and Kessler buys the station for pennies." Elmer stared at the water. His pride rested on being useful wire for a broken fence, a hard ride for a scattered herd. Yet his quickest answer here had nearly ruined years of careful sharing. "I'm sorry," Elmer said. The words were plain and cost him something. "I don't know how to stand idle when there's work in front of me, but I'm learning the difference between work and meddling." Dora looked at him. The harsh line of her mouth softened just a fraction. "My mule is loose in the corral," she said. "If you want to be useful, try getting a halter on him." Elmer spent the next 20 minutes being outmaneuvered by a one-eared mule that refused to let him within 10 feet. Every time Elmer stepped left, the mule stepped right. Finally, Dora walked into the pen, held out her hand, and the mule trotted over, pressing its nose into her palm. Elmer leaned against the fence and tipped back his hat. "That beast has better judgment than my former employer." Dora smiled. It came and went quickly, but Elmer felt the loss of it after it vanished. The sound of hooves broke the moment. A lone rider trotted into the yard. It was one of Kessler's foremen. He didn't dismount. He tossed a small leather pouch onto the dirt near Elmer's boots. "Mr. Kessler says there's double your month's wages in there," the foreman said. "He wants you back at the camp by nightfall. Says a man with your talents shouldn't be dying for a dry well." Elmer didn't look at the pouch. "Tell Kessler I'm busy." "Doing what?" the foreman sneered. "Learning work I should have learned years ago," Elmer said. The foreman spat, turned his horse, and rode out. That evening, Elmer found Dora in the kitchen, scrubbing the soot off a kerosene lamp. "You should get some sleep," Elmer said from the doorway. "You've been running since dawn." Dora didn't look up. "If I sleep, Kessler's men will sneak down and break the lower trough." "I'll take the first watch," Elmer said. Dora stopped scrubbing. She looked at him, her eyes guarded. "Why?" "Because if you drop from exhaustion, I'm out of a job," he said mildly. "Let me watch the yard. I won't touch the water. I won't move any rocks. I'll just make sure nobody else does either." Dora studied him for a long time. 2 hours, she finally said. "And you stay on the porch. You don't go wandering up the ridge." "Yes, ma'am." The next morning, Elmer kept his word. He sat on the porch step with his Winchester across his lap. When a freight wagon rolled in early, the driver tried to pull his team beside the shallow upper trough. Elmer stepped out, caught the lead horse's bridle, and guided the team to the heavier basin across the yard. A passenger climbed down a dusty man in a bowler hat. He looked at the low water level. "Here the girl running this place is hoarding the spring," the man said loudly. "Selfish way to run a business." Anger rose hot in Elmer, but he held it. "Ask Miss Sloane when she wakes," he said. "It is her station, and she can answer for it better than I can." The passenger scowled. Elmer let him. Dora's name was not his to borrow for an argument she had not chosen. An hour later, a clean tin cup waited beside his bedroll, filled with clear, cold water. He drank slowly. Out here, water was life. Giving it was a choice. By the fourth night, Kessler had moved the herd close enough that the lowing of thirsty cattle rolled off the limestone ridges. Before supper, Mansi rode toward town. With Dora's notice, anyone claiming a share of the spring was to bring a bucket and stand for the same right in every channel. Elmer woke before dawn on the fifth day. Mansi had not yet returned. He went to the corral and saddled Dora's fastest station gelding. He did not mount. He tied the horse to the rail facing the open road. When he turned around, Dora was standing on the porch, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She was staring at the saddled horse. "You leaving?" she asked. Her voice was flat, betraying nothing. Elmer walked to the porch. "No. I saddled him so you'd know the road is open. If Kessler comes with 30 men, I don't want my being here to make the choice for you. The gelding is ready if you need him." Dora looked from the horse to Elmer. She pulled the shawl tighter. "My mother placed those 3 stones," she said softly. "She and Mansi's mother did it before the town was built, before Kessler brought his cattle. When my mother died, Valentine Wilder, the freight agent the town used to settle disputes, told me to keep Mansi's name out of it. He said some settlers would tear out the stones rather than admit a Lakota woman had equal say over the water." Elmer stayed quiet, letting her speak. "I let them call me selfish," Dora said, looking down at her hands. "I let them think I was just a greedy spinster hoarding the spring because it was safer than the truth. But now Kessler's going to take it anyway." Elmer leaned against the porch post. "5 years ago I had a little spread down in Kansas," he said slowly. "Creek was drying up. I didn't ask the neighbors, I just went up and dynamited a rock jam to widen my flow. It worked. But it dried out the brush on the east side. Lightning struck a week later. Burned my cabin, my barn, and half the neighbors' grazing land." Dora looked at him, her eyes widening slightly. "I've been trying to fix things ever since," Elmer said. He looked out at the dark road. "If I'm not fixing something, I'm just a man who burned his own life down." Dora walked down the steps. She stopped right in front of him. "You put your hands to every trouble before anyone can tell you to stand back," she said. "Maybe standing back feels too much like being of no use." Elmer swallowed hard. He didn't look away. "Yeah, I reckon that's true." "I don't need you to fix this, Elmer," she said. "But I do need you." Elmer's grip tightened on the porch post. Her words struck harder than Kessler's horse ever could. He wanted to reach out to pull her against his chest, to promise her he'd shoot Kessler off his horse if he had to. But that would be fixing it. That would be taking control. Instead, he kept his hands at his sides. "What do you mean to do, Dora?" She looked toward the ridge. "I sent Mansi to call an open water drawing at noon. I'm telling the town the truth. Anyone who wants a share must stand here and acknowledge Mansi's share as well." "And if no one comes?" Elmer asked. "Then Kessler takes it," she said. Mansi returned just after sunrise. By mid-morning, a dust cloud had risen behind the eastern ridge. Kessler was bringing the herd. Kessler himself rode into the station yard with 6 of his hardest men. Elmer was fixing a hinge on the corral gate. He didn't reach for his gun. He just wiped his hands on a rag and waited. Dora stepped out onto the porch, Mancy standing like a shadow beside her. "Last chance, Miss Sloane," Kessler called out. He threw a heavy leather bag onto the dirt. It clinked with gold coins. "That's for the station. I'll take the deed now." He looked at Elmer. "And Parrish, you can have your old job, your horse, and a cut of the herd. All you have to do is saddle up and ride out." Dora looked at Elmer. She didn't say a word. She just left the choice hanging in the air. She was giving him an out, a chance to start over, to buy his land back. Elmer walked over to his saddle resting on the fence rail. He drew his knife. For a second, Kessler smiled. Then Elmer took the blade and sliced the leather brand off the fender of the saddle, Kessler's brand. He tossed the scrap of leather into the dirt next to the gold. "I'm not for hire," Elmer said. One of Kessler's men kicked his horse forward, crowding Elmer against the fence. The horse's shoulders slammed into Elmer's chest, knocking the breath out of him. Elmer stumbled back, hitting the timber rail hard. The man reached for his Colt. Elmer's hand hovered over his own gun. He looked at Dora. "Do you want me to stop them?" he asked, his voice strained. Dora stepped off the porch. "No. Just give me room to speak." Elmer forced his hand away from his belt and then stepped aside, opening the ground between Kessler and Dora. A few cowboys laughed. Let them. Dora had asked for room, and room was what he would give her. "The water isn't for sale," Dora said, her voice carrying over the yard. "And it isn't mine to sell." Mancy stepped forward. "The stones stay," the Lakota woman said. "The water flows to the town, to the station, and to my people. If you bring your cattle to the stones, you will find us standing on them." Kessler sneered. "Just the 3 of you against 1,000 head of cattle." "We'll be at the gorge at noon." He wheeled his horse and rode out. The silence rushed back in. Elmer rubbed his chest where the horse had hit him. Dora walked over to him. She didn't ask if he was hurt. She just pointed to the barn. "Go to sleep. You've been up all night." "They're coming at noon," Elmer argued, "which is why you need to rest." Dora said, her tone brooking no argument. "I'll watch the road. Go." The order landed strangely warm. Dora had begun to count his strength as something worth protecting. Elmer nodded and went to the barn. When he woke 2 hours later, the yard was strangely quiet. He walked out to find Dora and Mancy sitting on the porch, carving notches into small wooden sticks. "Tally sticks," Dora explained without looking up. "For the draw." Elmer looked at the wagon road. There was no one coming from town. No wagons, no riders. He sat down on the step below Dora. "If they bring the herd all at once, they'll crush the banks," he said quietly. "But if we funnel them through the old side trail 20 at a time, the water won't foul." "Can you do that without drawing a gun?" Dora asked. "If Kessler listens," Elmer said. He looked at his boots. "Dora, if this works, if the town shows up and the water stays." He stopped, struggling to find the words. "I'm afraid you won't have a reason to let me stick around." Dora stopped carving. She didn't offer a sweet reassurance. Instead, she reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a folded, faded piece of paper. She handed it to him. It was a hand-drawn map of the upper gorge showing every hidden seep and spring. "I've never shown that to anyone," Dora said. "Not even the marshal." Elmer held the paper like glass. No one had trusted him with anything so easily ruined since the fire. He folded the map exactly as Dora had given it. A braying sound interrupted them. The one-eared mule had gotten loose again and was chewing on a wagon wheel. Elmer sighed and stood up. He walked over, held out his hand, and miraculously, the mule stood still, letting Elmer grab the halter. Elmer patted the mule's neck and allowed himself one proud breath. Then he noticed Dora on the porch, lowering 2 fingers. The mule had been watching her all along. Elmer pretended not to see. Dora pretended not to smile. Between them, the mule kept the secret. At noon, the rumble of the herd sounded like thunder. The dust cloud blotted out the sun over the ridge. Elmer, Dora, and Mancy stood shoulder to shoulder by the main trough. Through the dust, Kessler's riders appeared pushing the lead steers. But before they reached the station boundary, another sound broke through. The rattle of wagon wheels. From the town road, a line of wagons and riders appeared. It was the blacksmith, the mercantile owner, the school teacher. Families carrying wooden buckets and tin pails. They weren't armed for a war. They were armed for chores. They walked past Kessler's surprised men and lined up at the trough. Dora stepped up onto the limestone block. "The water is open," she called out, but the shares remain as they were drawn. Mancy stepped up beside her. "My people draw at dusk. The town draws at noon. The herd drinks in groups of 20. Kessler pushed his horse through the crowd. "I ain't waiting all day to water my beef." Elmer stepped forward. He didn't stand in front of Dora. He stood directly beside her. "You bring 1,000 head down that bank at once, they'll trample it to mud." Elmer said, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who knew cattle better than he knew himself. "You'll kill half of them in the crush, and the water will be useless for a week. I'll funnel them through the side trail, 20 at a time. Nobody loses a steer, and the spring stays clean." Kessler looked from Mancy to Dora and Elmer, then at the townspeople who bought his beef and shot his horses. Forcing the bank now meant trampling their buckets. Kessler spat in the dust. "Start the funnel, Parrish, and it better be fast." The tension broke. The townspeople began filling their buckets. Jasper Cole, the blacksmith, removed his hat. "Miss Sloane, I repeated talk about you without ever climbing that ridge. I was wrong." The mercantile owner lowered his eyes. 2 women near the trough did the same. Dora held Jasper's gaze. "Then the next time a man profits from a rumor, ask who he hopes you will blame." Jasper nodded once. The apology could not return the months she had endured, but when the line began moving again, no one called her selfish. Elmer turned to Dora. "I don't just want to be the man who stands here when the guns are drawn," he said, his voice rough. "I want to be the man who's still here when you open the water on a quiet Tuesday." Dora looked at him without the old guard in her eyes. She took his hand in front of the town, in front of Kessler, in front of everyone. "Then stand beside me," she said. Her voice thickened, but it did not falter. "Never in my place." She squeezed his hand, then walked over to the trough and lifted the wooden gate to open the main flow. Late that afternoon, when the last steer had been watered and the townspeople had begun harnessing their teams, Elmer and Mancy rode up to the gorge to check the upper seep. They found the water still sluggish. Elmer followed the trickle into a narrow ravine. Hidden beneath a pile of dry brush was a willow dam braced with a short length of wagon chain. One link had been cut recently. A square-headed iron staple pinned the chain through a crosspiece, and a tiny crescent had been punched into its crown. Elmer worked the staple loose and rolled it between his fingers. Jasper Cole marks his iron with that crescent. Mancy studied the fresh cut on the chain. Then we asked the man who forged it where this one went. They carried the chain and staple back to the station. Kessler was still watering the last portion of his herd when Jasper examined the iron. "Could have been stolen from any wagon," Kessler said. Jasper shook his head. "Not this staple. Wilder ordered 12 square-headed ones for the brake rack in his freight shed. Common heads kept twisting loose. I forged them from the same plowshare and marked each twice with my crescent. He turned the staple over. A second shallower crescent showed beneath the mud. This is one of mine. The mercantile owner crouched beside the chain. Wilder's lead freight wagon came through yesterday with its brake chain shortened by 1 link. His driver said it snapped on the north road. Kessler's face darkened. Wilder told me Dora was choking the spring. And you brought guns before you troubled to look, Dora said. Being deceived does not excuse what you chose. Kessler's hand tightened on his reins. For a moment, Elmer thought pride might drive him back toward the gorge. Then Kessler looked at the townspeople gathered around the iron at Mansi and at his own exhausted cattle drinking safely in ordered groups. He ordered his men to pull every false stake clear the diverted channel and keep the herd to Elmer's side trail. Then Jasper and the mercantile owner rode with him toward town. Wilder could dismiss one woman as troublesome. He would have a harder time explaining the blacksmith's iron, the shortened chain, and 3 witnesses standing in his freight yard. Dora and Mansi arranged a rotating watch between the station and the Lakota camp. The town would supply a 3rd rider. No single mediator would hold the valley's trust again. As the sun began to set, painting the Dakota sky in bruised purples and burnt orange, Elmer carried the cracked limestone rock back to the groove he had torn it from. He held it over the dirt. He didn't drop it. He looked up at Dora, who was standing by the trough. "Here," he asked. Dora walked over. She crouched down in the mud right next to him. She placed her hand over his. "Right here," she said. Together they lowered the stone into the earth, securing the boundary. That evening, Elmer did not carry his saddle back to the hay. He laid it across the porch rail and left it there. He sat on the edge of the wooden trough, listening to clear water move through the station channel. Dora came from the kitchen with 2 tin cups. She handed him one and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "The barn is for hired men," she said. Elmer glanced at the saddle. "I am not hired." "No." She turned the cup between her hands. "And I do not want you staying because the spring needs another rifle." He waited. Waiting had once felt like uselessness. Beside Dora, it had begun to feel like respect. She looked at him. "I want you here because I do. Stay through winter. After that, if you still mean what you said at the trough, you may court me." Elmer's throat tightened. "May I court you before winter?" Slowly. How slowly? Slow enough to ask before moving anything larger than a spoon. A laugh escaped him low and surprised. "Dora Sloane, may I stay and court you at a pace approved by the keeper of the spring?" Her smile returned and stayed this time. "You may stay, Elmer Parrish. The pace remains subject to correction." He offered his hand instead of taking hers. Dora set down her cup and laced her fingers through his. Darkness gathered over the station. Up on the ridge, the spring kept all 3 of its branches. For the first time in years, Elmer heard running water and did not search for something to mend. He only listened while Dora's hand rested in his and stayed.